When Midway fell, the moment German generals knew America would win. Berlin, June 7, 1942. The telegram arrives in the early morning hours, coded and urgent, marked for immediate distribution to the Wehrmacht High Command. The message is brief, clinical in its language, but devastating in its implications. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers destroyed. Battle of Midway. American victory. In a conference room deep within the Reich Chancellery, a group of German generals gather around a map table. The room is thick with cigar smoke and tension. These are not the fanatics. These are the professionals, men who understand logistics, industrial capacity, and the cold mathematics of modern warfare. Generaloberst Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, removes his spectacles and sets them down on the table. He says nothing. He doesn't need to. Everyone in that room knows what this means. The war, their war, has just become unwinnable. Not today, not tomorrow, but inevitably. Because Midway didn't just sink 4 Japanese carriers. It revealed something far more terrifying. America had learned how to fight a modern war, and they had learned it faster than anyone thought possible. The morning the news arrived. On the morning of June 7, 1942, most Germans woke to news of continued victories. The newspapers printed stories of U-boat triumphs in the Atlantic, advances in North Africa under Rommel, and preparations for the great summer offensive in Russia. The war was going well, or so it seemed. But in the halls of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command of the Armed Forces, a different reality was taking shape. The intelligence reports coming from Tokyo were fragmentary at first, even contradictory. The Japanese were notoriously secretive about their losses, a cultural trait that frustrated their German allies. But by June 7th, the picture was clear enough. At Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral in the Central Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered a catastrophic defeat. 4 fleet carriers sunk. Over 300 aircraft lost. More than 3,000 sailors and pilots dead, including some of Japan's most experienced naval aviators. The Americans, by contrast, had lost 1 carrier and a destroyer. The exchange rate was devastating. At first glance, it seemed strange that German generals would care deeply about a naval battle between Japan and the United States. Germany's war was in Europe, in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, in the deserts of North Africa, and increasingly in the skies over the Reich itself. But the German High Command understood something that the Nazi propagandists and ideologues did not. This was a truly global war, and the fates of the Axis powers were interconnected. Germany had been at war with the Soviet Union for exactly 1 year. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, had come agonizingly close to destroying the Red Army and capturing Moscow. But the Soviet Union had survived, barely. And now, in the summer of 1942, Germany was preparing another massive offensive, this time aimed at the oil fields of the Caucasus. But oil was exactly the problem. Germany was starving for resources. Every strategic calculation the German General Staff made came back to the same brutal reality. Germany lacked the raw materials, the fuel, and the industrial capacity to fight a prolonged war against multiple great powers. Japan was supposed to be the solution to part of this problem. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, German generals had been cautiously optimistic, not because they particularly trusted the Japanese, but because Japan's entry into the war meant the United States would be forced to fight a 2-ocean war. America's industrial might would be divided. More importantly, Japan's offensive into Southeast Asia and the Pacific would threaten British possessions, secure vital resources for the Axis, and most critically, keep pressure on the Soviet Union's eastern flank. Stalin had been forced to keep significant forces in Siberia to guard against a possible Japanese invasion. Those were divisions that could not be sent west to fight Germany. Midway changed that calculation overnight. The initial German reaction to news of Midway was disbelief, even skepticism. Admiral Erich Raeder, commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, reportedly questioned the accuracy of the reports. Surely the Americans were exaggerating their victory for propaganda purposes. Surely the Japanese losses could not be as severe as claimed. This skepticism was rooted in recent experience. For the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan had seemed unstoppable. Hong Kong, the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, all had fallen with shocking speed. The British Eastern Fleet had been mauled in the Indian Ocean. The myth of Western invincibility in Asia had been shattered. How could such a formidable fighting force be crippled in a single day? But as more intelligence came in, from intercepts, from neutral observers, from the Japanese themselves, the truth became undeniable. Midway was a disaster. German generals had seen naval defeats before. The Kriegsmarine itself had suffered painful losses. But Midway was different, and the German naval staff knew it immediately. This was not a battle won by superior numbers or by lucky circumstance. The Americans had been outnumbered at Midway. The Japanese fleet had been larger, more experienced, and sailing with the confidence of 6 months of unbroken victories. And yet the Americans had won decisively. The reports described something that chilled the professional military men in Berlin. The Americans had demonstrated a level of strategic intelligence, operational planning, and tactical execution that suggested they were learning, and learning at a terrifying pace. The Americans had broken Japanese naval codes. They had known the Japanese were coming. They had positioned their carriers in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. And when the moment came, American dive bombers had struck with devastating precision. 5 minutes. That's how long it took to turn the tide of the Pacific War. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were turned into floating infernos. A 4th would follow hours later. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific was effectively destroyed. In the days following the initial reports, the German High Command began to conduct what they called Lagebeurteilung, situation assessments. These were sober, professional analyses stripped of propaganda and wishful thinking. Franz Halder, the chief of the General Staff, was particularly methodical about this. Halder was no Nazi fanatic. He would later be arrested for his peripheral involvement in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler. He was a professional officer who understood that wars were won by logistics, production, and the steady accumulation of military power. Halder's assessment was grim. Midway meant that Japan would be forced onto the defensive. The great offensive momentum that had characterized the first 6 months of the Pacific War was broken. Japan would now have to defend a vast perimeter with diminishing resources and, critically, irreplaceable losses in experienced pilots and aircrew. And if Japan was on the defensive, what did that mean for Germany? The answer was nothing good. Germany had been counting on Japan to keep the Soviets looking east. But after Midway, it became clear that Japan would be in no position to threaten the Soviet Far East. Stalin could begin transferring Siberian divisions west, fresh, cold-weather troops who had not been ground down by 2 years of brutal combat. Moreover, Midway signaled that the United States Navy would not be tied down in the Pacific indefinitely. If the Americans could cripple Japanese offensive power this quickly, they would eventually be able to shift resources to the Atlantic, to North Africa, to the inevitable invasion of Europe. The two-ocean war that was supposed to overwhelm America was instead becoming a coordinated global assault on the Axis. There were no emergency meetings, no dramatic speeches, no breaking of champagne glasses in frustration. The German reaction to Midway was quieter, more insidious. It was the slow dawning of a terrible realization. In the officers' clubs, in the planning rooms, in the private conversations between generals who had known each other for decades, a new tone emerged. It was subtle, never explicit, but unmistakable to those who knew how to listen. The talk shifted from when we win to if we can force a negotiated peace. Contingency plans began to be drawn up, not for total victory, but for defensive lines that could be held indefinitely. The Ostwall, a fortified line in the east. the Atlantic Wall in the west. These were not the plans of a power expecting triumph. These were the plans of a regime beginning to think about survival. One German general, his name was never recorded in the official minutes, reportedly said in a staff meeting in mid-June 1942, "If the Americans can do to the Japanese what they did at Midway, what do you think they will do to us when they turn their full attention to Europe?" No one had a good answer, because everyone in that room knew the truth. America had not yet even begun to mobilize its full strength. The factories were just getting started. The training camps were just filling up. The vast industrial and human resources of the United States were still being converted from a peacetime to a wartime economy. And if America could win at Midway with what was essentially a pre-war navy, hastily assembled and still learning how to fight, what would they be capable of in 1943? In 1944, the implications were staggering. How German generals viewed America. To understand why Midway was such a psychological shock to the German high command, we need to understand how Germany viewed the United States before June 1942. The Nazi regime had cultivated a specific image of America, a mongrel nation, weakened by democracy, corrupted by capitalism and Jewish influence, lacking the martial spirit necessary for modern warfare. Hitler himself had repeatedly dismissed American military potential. In his view, the United States was a country of shopkeepers and stock traders, incapable of producing warriors who could match the ideologically hardened soldiers of the Third Reich. But the professional military officers of the Wehrmacht knew better. They had to. Their lives and the survival of Germany depended on accurate assessments, not comforting delusions. The German General Staff had studied American military performance in World War I. They remembered that in 1918, the arrival of American forces in France had tipped the balance decisively against Germany. Fresh, well-supplied American divisions had broken the stalemate of trench warfare and forced Germany to seek an armistice. But that was a generation ago. Since then, America had demobilized almost completely. The U.S. Army of the 1930s was smaller than that of Poland. The U.S. Navy, though large, was scattered across two oceans and had not fought a major engagement since World War I. Could America really build a modern military from scratch? Many German officers were skeptical, not because they bought into Nazi racial theories, but because they understood the difficulty of creating an effective fighting force. It wasn't just about building tanks and planes. It was about doctrine, training, leadership, combat experience, things that took years, even decades, to develop. The German Wehrmacht of 1939 was the product of 2 decades of secret rearmament, innovative tactical thinking, and the harsh lessons of World War I. The officer corps was professional, educated, and experienced. How could America possibly catch up? But even as German generals doubted American military skill, they feared American industrial capacity. This fear was not irrational. It was based on hard data. In 1940, the United States produced more steel than Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined. American automobile production dwarfed that of all European nations. The U.S. had vast reserves of oil, rubber, copper, and every other resource necessary for modern war. German intelligence reports from the late 1930s had warned about this. One report, submitted to the German General Staff in 1939, concluded that, in a prolonged war against the United States, Germany cannot win through industrial production alone. Our only hope is to achieve decisive military victories before American industry can be fully mobilized. This was the gamble Germany took when it declared war on the United States in December 1941. Hitler believed, or claimed to believe, that America was too weak, too divided, too decadent to mobilize its industrial power effectively. He bet that Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor would keep America tied down in the Pacific. He bet that Germany could defeat the Soviet Union before America became a factor in Europe. Midway was the moment that bet started to look very, very bad. One of the most dangerous mistakes the Nazi leadership made was confusing American culture with American weakness. Americans didn't march in torchlight parades. They didn't worship military glory. Their political system was messy, argumentative, seemingly chaotic. To the Nazis, this looked like weakness. But German generals understood something the Nazi ideologues did not. Democracies can fight. In fact, in some ways, democracies could be more dangerous than dictatorships. A dictatorship might mobilize faster initially, but a democracy, once fully committed, could draw on reserves of national will and industrial capacity that totalitarian states could only dream of. America in 1942 was not the same country that had been isolationist in 1939. Pearl Harbor had unified the nation in a way that no political speech could. The attack had been so shocking, so unexpected, so devastating that it had crystallized American public opinion overnight. America wasn't just in the war. America was angry. And an angry, industrialized democracy with 130 million people and limitless resources was not an enemy to take lightly. In the months between Pearl Harbor and Midway, December 1941 to June 1942, German military intelligence had been tracking American mobilization with growing concern. The numbers were staggering. American aircraft production was ramping up faster than anyone had predicted. Liberty ships were sliding into the water at a rate of 3 per day. Training camps were processing hundreds of thousands of recruits, but there was still a question mark. Could America actually fight? Production was one thing. Combat effectiveness was another. The early American performance in the Pacific had been mixed. The Philippines had fallen. Wake Island had been overrun. American forces had retreated again and again in the face of Japanese offensives. Some German observers took comfort in this. Perhaps American industrial power was real, but American fighting quality was not. Midway shattered that comforting illusion. Midway demonstrated that America had something even more dangerous than industrial capacity: the ability to learn. The battle revealed several things that shocked the German high command. First, American intelligence was superb. The fact that U.S. codebreakers had penetrated Japanese naval communications and predicted the attack on Midway showed a level of sophistication that few had expected from a nation that had been at peace just 6 months earlier. Second, American logistics were extraordinary. The Yorktown, crippled at the Battle of the Coral Sea a month earlier, should have been in a repair yard for months. Instead, American work crews repaired the carrier in 72 hours, a feat that stunned even the Americans themselves. This demonstrated an industrial and organizational capability that went beyond mere production numbers. Third, American tactical execution was becoming competent. The actual attack that sank the Japanese carriers was carried out by dive bomber pilots, many of whom had never been in combat before. Yet they pressed home their attacks with devastating effectiveness, even in the face of intense anti-aircraft fire and defending fighters. Fourth, and most ominously, America was willing to take calculated risks. The decision to commit all available carriers to defend Midway, despite being outnumbered, showed that American commanders were not timid. They were aggressive, willing to gamble when the strategic situation demanded it. This was not the soft, hesitant, inexperienced military that Nazi propaganda had promised. This was a modern, professional, learning organization, and it was improving at an alarming rate. After Midway, the tone of German intelligence assessments about America began to change. Before Midway, reports had emphasized American inexperience, the chaotic nature of American mobilization, the likelihood that it would take years for America to become a serious threat. After Midway, the emphasis shifted. Now the reports focused on American adaptability, the speed of American learning, the terrifying efficiency of American production. One intelligence summary from July 1942 noted that the Americans appear capable of correcting deficiencies in doctrine and equipment at a speed we did not anticipate. They are not repeating the mistakes of 1917-1918, when it took them nearly 2 years to field an effective force. This time, they appear to be learning in months what took us years. This was the nightmare scenario for Germany. Not just that America was strong, but that America was improving, and improving faster than Germany could exploit its early advantages. Within the German officer corps, there was a generational divide in how Midway was interpreted. Older officers, veterans of World War I who remembered fighting against American forces in 1918, tended to be more concerned. They had seen firsthand what American industrial and military power could accomplish once fully mobilized. Younger officers, especially those who had risen through the ranks during the Nazi period, were more dismissive. They had grown up on stories of German military supremacy, of the invincibility of German arms. They still believed in the myth of the master race and the inevitable triumph of National Socialism. But even among the younger officers, Midway planted seeds of doubt. Because Midway was not a battle won by superior ideology, it was a battle won by superior intelligence, better planning, and more effective execution. These were things that could be measured, analyzed, and compared. And when German officers did that analysis objectively, the results were deeply troubling. By the summer of 1942, a quiet consensus was forming among the professional officers of the German General Staff. America was going to be a far more formidable opponent than Nazi ideology had allowed them to believe. This realization didn't lead to defeatism. Not yet. The war was far from over. Germany still held vast territories, still had millions of soldiers under arms, still had realistic hopes of defeating the Soviet Union. But Midway had been a warning shot. It was a glimpse of what was coming. A two-front war against opponents who could match or exceed Germany in every dimension of military power. Production, technology, intelligence, and increasingly, combat effectiveness. And the cold, mathematical truth was beginning to sink in. In a prolonged war of attrition, Germany could not win. Not against the Soviet Union alone. Certainly not against the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States combined. The question was no longer whether Germany could achieve total victory. The question was whether Germany could survive. Why Midway was strategically terrifying. To most people, then and now, Midway is remembered as a great naval battle. 4 Japanese carriers sunk, a turning point in the Pacific War, a David versus Goliath story of American underdogs defeating a superior enemy. But to the professional military analysts in Berlin, Midway meant something far more profound and terrifying. It wasn't just about ships and planes. It was about what the battle revealed about the nature of modern warfare and America's ability to wage it. First, Midway confirmed something that some military theorists had suspected, but many had refused to believe. The aircraft carrier had replaced the battleship as the dominant weapon of naval warfare. This was a revolutionary change, and it happened almost overnight. For centuries, naval warfare had been about big guns on big ships. The nation with the most powerful battleships controlled the seas. Germany's own naval strategy was based on this assumption. But at Midway, the ships that decided the battle never saw each other. The carriers launched aircraft that attacked targets hundreds of miles away. The battle was won and lost by pilots, not by gunnery officers. And the Americans had mastered this new form of warfare faster than anyone thought possible. This had immediate implications for Germany. The Kriegsmarine had invested heavily in surface ships, battleships, cruisers, pocket battleships. These were expensive, prestigious weapons that took years to build. But if carriers were now the dominant naval weapon, Germany's naval strategy was obsolete. The Kriegsmarine had exactly 0 operational aircraft carriers. Germany had started building one, but it had never been completed. In the new carrier-dominated naval warfare, Germany was simply not competitive. This meant that Germany could never seriously challenge Anglo-American naval supremacy. And without naval supremacy, Germany could never effectively blockade Britain, never threaten American supply lines, never prevent the inevitable Allied invasion of Europe. Midway had revealed the future of naval warfare, and Germany wasn't part of that future. But the strategic implications went deeper than just carriers versus battleships. Midway revealed that the Americans had won a different kind of battle before the shooting even started. The intelligence battle. German military intelligence was well aware that the Americans had broken Japanese naval codes. This was in itself a stunning achievement. The Japanese cipher was highly complex, and the fact that American cryptographers had penetrated it so quickly was impressive. But what really alarmed German intelligence analysts was what the Americans had done with that information. They had set a trap. A perfect trap. The Americans had known the Japanese were coming to Midway. They had known the composition of the Japanese fleet, the timing of the attack, even the planned order of battle. And instead of simply reinforcing Midway, they had positioned their carriers in exactly the right place to ambush the Japanese fleet. This demonstrated a level of signals intelligence, operational security, and strategic deception that few had expected from the Americans, and it raised a terrifying question. If the Americans could do this to Japanese codes, what were they doing to German codes? This question was not hypothetical. By June 1942, British intelligence at Bletchley Park had been reading German Enigma encrypted messages for over 2 years. The Americans were increasingly involved in this effort as well, sharing intelligence and contributing their own cryptographic expertise. German signals security had always been a weak point, though the German high command didn't fully realize how weak. The Germans believed their Enigma machines were unbreakable. They were wrong. Midway demonstrated that Allied signals intelligence was not just competent, it was war-winning. If the Allies could read German communications the way they read Japanese communications, the strategic implications were catastrophic. Every troop movement, every supply convoy, every operational plan, all could be compromised. And in fact, this is exactly what was happening. The Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic was heavily dependent on intelligence derived from decrypted German messages. Allied commanders knew where U-boat wolf packs were forming, which convoys were threatened, which routes were safe. Midway was a warning that in modern warfare, the side that controlled information had an almost insurmountable advantage, and Germany was losing the information war. There was another aspect of Midway that particularly alarmed German military analysts: the Japanese loss of experienced pilots. At Midway, Japan lost approximately 110 pilots and aircrew. These were not novices. These were men who had trained for years, who had combat experience going back to China in the 1930s, who represented the elite of Japanese naval aviation. And they were irreplaceable. This was something German officers understood intimately, because Germany was facing the same problem. The Luftwaffe had dominated the skies in the early years of the war, but by 1942, Luftwaffe pilot losses were mounting. Every month, experienced pilots were being shot down over Britain, over the Atlantic, over Russia. Training new pilots took time, typically 18-24 months to produce a combat-ready fighter pilot. And as the war dragged on, Germany was cutting training time to replace losses more quickly. This meant newer pilots were less skilled, which meant they were more likely to be shot down, which meant even more losses. It was a death spiral. Japan faced the same problem, and Midway had accelerated it catastrophically. In one day, Japan lost a significant percentage of its most skilled carrier pilots. The Americans, by contrast, had pilot training programs that dwarfed anything Japan or Germany could produce. By 1943, the United States would be graduating more than 100,000 pilots per year from its training programs. These were not hastily trained replacements. They were receiving thorough, high-quality instruction. Germany and Japan simply could not match this. And in modern warfare, where air superiority was increasingly decisive, this was a death sentence. Perhaps the most frightening aspect of Midway, from a German perspective, was what it revealed about American adaptability. The United States had entered the war with outdated doctrine, inadequate equipment, and no recent combat experience. By all rights, it should have taken years for America to become competitive with battle-hardened German and Japanese forces. Instead, America was improving at a staggering pace. Consider the timeline. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The U.S. Pacific Fleet is crippled. America is humiliated. February 1942, Japan continues its offensive. The Philippines are falling. Singapore falls. The Dutch East Indies fall. American forces retreat everywhere. May 1942, Battle of the Coral Sea. The first carrier battle in history. Tactically inconclusive, but strategically it stops the Japanese advance. June 4, 1942, Midway. Complete American victory. Japanese offensive capability destroyed. 6 months. That's how long it took America to go from Pearl Harbor to Midway. 6 months to rebuild its fleet, retrain its forces, develop new tactics, and execute a near-perfect ambush of a superior enemy force. This learning curve terrified German military analysts, because if America could improve that quickly in naval warfare, how fast would it improve in land warfare? In amphibious operations? In strategic bombing? The implication was clear. America was not going to remain inexperienced for long. But perhaps the most strategically significant revelation at Midway was not about the battle itself, but about what happened before it. The US Yorktown had been severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May 1942. Under normal circumstances, repairing a carrier with that much damage would take months. The ship would sail back to a major naval yard on the west coast, go into dry dock, and undergo extensive repairs. The Americans repaired it in 72 hours. When Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor on May 27th, it was estimated that repairs would take 3 months. Admiral Chester Nimitz said he needed the ship ready in 3 days. American work crews swarmed over the carrier. They worked around the clock, cutting corners, making temporary repairs, doing whatever was necessary to get the ship combat ready. Welders worked while the ship was being refueled. Damaged areas that couldn't be fully repaired were shored up and sealed off. On May 30th, just 72 hours later, Yorktown sailed out to meet the Japanese fleet. This was the moment German naval officers realized American industrial capability was not just about building new ships. It was about maintaining, repairing, and sustaining a fleet under combat conditions. German shipyards couldn't do what Pearl Harbor had done with Yorktown. When major German warships were damaged, they stayed in port for months. German naval maintenance was thorough, professional, and slow. American naval maintenance was fast, flexible, and effective enough to turn a crippled carrier into a combat-ready warship in 3 days. What else could they do? After Midway, some German staff officers began doing grim calculations. At Midway, the exchange rate was 4 Japanese carriers for 1 American carrier. That sounds like a great victory for America, and it was. But the real terror wasn't in the exchange rate. It was in the replacement rate. Japan, with its limited industrial base and resources, might be able to replace those 4 carriers in 2 to 3 years. Maybe. The United States could replace them in 6 months. In fact, by late 1942, American shipyards were launching a new fleet carrier every 2 months. By 1943, the rate would increase even further. The same mathematics applied to aircraft, to tanks, to artillery, to every weapon system that mattered in modern war. Germany was producing approximately 15,000 aircraft in 1942. The Soviet Union was producing about 25,000. The United States would produce 47,000, and that was just the beginning of American mobilization. In 1943, America would produce 86,000 aircraft. In 1944, over 96,000. These were not just numbers in a report. These were physical weapons, fighters, bombers, transports, that would fill the skies over Europe and grind the Luftwaffe into dust. German generals understood mathematics. They understood production curves and replacement rates and attrition warfare. And when they did the math after Midway, the conclusion was inescapable. In a prolonged war, the Axis could not win. Numbers and statistics can be abstract. But Midway's psychological impact on the German High Command was very real and very personal. For the first time, senior German officers had to confront the possibility that Germany had made a catastrophic strategic error by declaring war on the United States. Hitler had declared war on America on December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor. He was not required to do so by Germany's alliance with Japan, but Hitler declared war anyway, partly out of ideological hostility to the United States, partly to support Japan, partly because U-boats were already engaged in an undeclared war with American ships in the Atlantic. Many professional German officers had thought this declaration was a mistake. Now, after Midway, it was beginning to look like a fatal mistake. Because Midway demonstrated that America would not be tied down indefinitely in the Pacific. The war against Japan would be won, perhaps not quickly, but inevitably. And when it was, America's full industrial and military might would turn toward Europe. Germany would face a two-front war against opponents it could not defeat individually, let alone combined. In the weeks after Midway, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere of German military planning sessions. No one said it out loud. No one dared. Speaking defeatism in Nazi Germany could be fatal, even for senior officers. But the questions changed. The tone changed. Instead of discussing how to win the war, staff officers began discussing how to avoid losing it, how to hold defensive lines, how to force a negotiated peace, how to drive a wedge between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. These were not the conversations of a regime confident in victory. One anecdote, perhaps apocryphal but widely repeated among German officers after the war, captures the moment. A young staff officer, newly assigned to the headquarters, asked his superior what Germany's strategy was now that America was in the war. The senior officer reportedly replied, "Our strategy is to win before America is fully mobilized. If we fail to do that, we have no strategy." After Midway, it was becoming clear that time was running out. Midway was the moment the facade cracked, the moment when Germany's most experienced military minds realized that the war could be lost. But understanding that the war could be lost was not the same as accepting it. The Wehrmacht was still the most powerful military machine in Europe. Germany still occupied vast territories from the Atlantic to the Caucasus. The Great Summer Offensive in Russia was about to begin, and it promised to deliver the oil fields Germany desperately needed. Victory was still possible. Barely. But now, for the first time, German generals had to confront an alternative future. One in which American industrial might, Soviet manpower, and British determination would slowly, inexorably, grind the Third Reich into dust. The question now was not whether Germany could win, but whether Germany would win. And that question depended on time, resources, and the ability to achieve decisive victories before American power fully arrived on European shores. After Midway, that window of opportunity was closing fast. What the German General Staff understood, what they had always understood, was that modern warfare was not won by courage alone, or by superior tactics, or even by better soldiers. Modern warfare was won in factories, and the factory war was one Germany was losing.